So, welcome everybody. We are going to start the first meeting of our summer road trip Shawl KAL. And what we're going to do tonight is we're going to go through our pattern. We'll talk about the inspirations, and I'm going to go through all of those words in there and give you a really good grasp of what the pattern says so that you won't actually need it again. One of the goals for this particular shawl is that it makes for really nice summer knitting. And it means that you aren't going to be glued to a computer or a piece of paper or your phone. You're just going to be able to sit back and enjoy that knitting, maybe put your feet up by a lake, maybe in your backyard, maybe on your couch with some good Netflix, whatever you want to do this summer that will take you away from it all. And that's what the road is going to be for me, is that it's going to be Netflix and chilling. Or whatever that means. I've heard some scurrilous things, but for me, it's going to involve cold beverages. So as part of this, what we'll do is we'll have everybody muted right now, but you're very welcome to ask questions in the chat, and we will give you some time to unmute and ask questions as well once I've done some tutorial things. If there's anything that's super urgent, like, the camera's not showing or anything like that, always feel free to let me know right away. And Heather will definitely be willing to break in and let us know at any point if there's something that needs to be answered right there and then. What I want for you is to be able to get a really good start and a foundation on this shawl. And anybody who is a beginner knitter, I think that this will help you as well. Do not feel nervous or worried or anything about this shawl, because there are various different ways that we can customize it for you so that anybody of any level can enjoy it. Also this evening, you'll want to stick around because we're going to do our usual prize draws. And this evening, it's going to be 2 gift certificates of $50, good for anything on our website. So we thought we'd mix it up a little bit and let you guys choose your prize this time via a gift certificate. So you'll want to be here because only the people who are actually in the meeting at the time will be eligible to win. Now, there will be further opportunities for prizes because I adore giving them out. So make sure that as you progress through your summer road trip, that you share your shawl on any sort of the forms of social media that you use. You can use, if you're on Instagram, for example, summer road trip shawl KAL. The hashtag exists there and you can post using that hashtag. And you can also post your progress in our Facebook group. And we have set up a thread on Ravelry. And of course, you can ask questions there too. So we will be drawing more prizes from those entries, which means that, you're participating and you're part of the KAL. And we have another meeting just like this in 2 weeks where we're going to reconvene, share our progress, and that'll be a great chance for you to ask any questions that you need to at that time too. And of course, be eligible for some prizes. So just to let you know, we were having a lot of fun putting together our ideas for prizes. So we have as a grand prize a sweater quantity of yarn, and we also have some really sweet mini skein sets for you. So that should be a lot of fun to draw those, but tonight it's gift certificates. Alrighty, so summer road trip shawl, where did this come from? Well, I wanted a shawl that was fun to knit and that kept me entertained, but that didn't mean that I had to look at the pattern too much. I really do like playing with color pooling yarns, and I actually hide a lot of pooling possibilities within our colorways. So since I've been teaching a lot of color pooling classes this year, I thought, why not design a shawl that picks up one of the more recent innovations in pooling, and it's a type of pooling called assigned pooling. Assigned pooling is where you take one color in a skein of yarn and you give it something to do. You assign it a stitch, and then you can use that in anything. So you could put that into a basic sweater, you could put it into mittens, you could put it into socks, shawls, and so on. And I figured, well, I love shawls. What better to do with this than to make a shawl? And also to give you a shawl that's a little bit of a different shape for some knitters. So the shawl that we are going to knit as part of this KAL is called an asymmetric biased shawl. And what that really means is that the shawl has a curve knit into it. And that curve means that it stays really nicely on your shoulders, because there are some of them that are a really interesting shape, really fun to play with. They do neat things with your stitches. And a perfect example is Find Your Fade by Andrea Mowry. But for me, with my narrow shoulders, I put it on and it goes floop and falls right off again. So I really love this asymmetric bias shawl because it has the curve built in that keeps it on my shoulders. And it's easy to style and wear in lots of different ways. And that's part of what we'll talk about in our next meeting is once you have it done, what do you do with it? Because some shawls are a little bit challenging in terms of how to wear them. This one is super user-friendly, but it's still useful to get some ideas for styling. So The asymmetric bias is really noticeable when you get to the earlier parts of the shawl where you see there's quite a curve. And so this is just a shawl that grows in one direction more than the other. And what you'll actually be doing through the progress of this shawl is moving stitches from one edge to the other to create that curve. So there's no complex shaping in here. It's just very simple little things that are happening on the border that create this shape. For those of you who are advanced knitters or a little bit more experienced and you want to make this shawl larger than the pattern states, just keep on knitting. You can knit this with as many skeins of yarn as you want, and you'll just keep getting a shawl that gets bigger and bigger, and it will eventually form a circle and overlap itself, but that keeps it super wearable and again, makes it very easy to style and keep on your shoulders. It also means you don't look kind of dated with the triangle shawl right in the center of your back. And it gives you sort of like a fun, funky, modern sort of look to your shawl wearing. And you can also use a shawl cuff really well on these. So the choice for this particular pattern was an asymmetric bias because it's fun. You'll learn a little bit of something about another shawl shape if you haven't knit this one before, and it's super wearable. You can also add color pops into this with leftovers of yarn or mini skeins. So you can, if you wanted to, you could just pop them right in the middle of the shawl randomly here and there. Or what we've done in this particular pattern with one of the samples is to use a mini skein as a pop of color on the border of a shawl. And I'm just going to spotlight Heather, who is holding up her beautiful shawl. Come on, and so that you can see her border. Heather, there she is. So there's Heather's gorgeous shawl where she has used a mini skein of lodgepole pine on her juniper shawl. And so it made for a really nice little flash of color on the edge of that shawl and a very pretty finish. All right. Now we will go back to me and replace the spotlight on me because, you know, that's very exciting for everybody. Now, the pattern you'll notice that when you get it is 7 pages long, and that's going to seem like, oh my goodness, I need this pattern for a lot, but really you don't. The goal of this pattern is to answer most questions that you would have in the course of this knitting experience so that they're there, they're in writing, and you don't have to worry about, well, what do I do if X happens? So what I strongly recommend is to read through the pattern from start to finish because it will include all of the tips and tricks and permissions that you need to kind of do a little bit of customizing along the way. The actual pattern itself with the cast on and the 2 whole rows of body are at the back of the patterns and it starts on page 6. Everything before that is things like your abbreviations, your notes on the pattern, and your techniques, also some stitch patterns. So I've had 1 or 2 people write me today and they were a little bit concerned about how the pattern's laid out, and it is actually really standard. It's just easy to miss the actual pattern because it's so short. So it is on page 6 where it tells you how to cast on, and then the entire shawl is knit using rows 1 and 2. And we're going to assign some color in there. So when you take a look at your pattern, you will find on page 2 your materials, and you will find some finished measurements. This pattern is not hugely gauge specific in terms of if you don't quite make the gauge, it's not a disaster. I have built a wee bit of margin in there for you if you should happen to have your gauge be a little bit bigger than the one that's listed in the pattern. And if your gauge is a lot smaller, then just knit past the numbers that are in the pattern. So what that means is if you're knitting the 2 skein version of the shawl and you get to a point where you have 192 stitches and it tells you to work the border, if you've got more yarn than it tells you that you need for the border, you could knit a little further. So very flexible in terms of that. The gauge is listed there and it is something to pay some attention to, but like I say, you got a little bit of room for moving around on there. If you're having trouble meeting the gauge of this, I was using a steel needle, so that might help you if you're trying to match that particular gauge. So material of your needles will actually affect your gauge. In particular, it really makes a difference on row gauge. So if you're having trouble getting your row gauge, try changing the material of your needle, and that will change how your shawl is going to behave in terms of gauge. I just saw a question flash by in the chat and somebody asked, what is gentian and what is juniper? Those are colorways from the Rock Garden collection, and they're what the 2 samples for the shawl were knit in. So this is a colorway called gentian, And the one that you saw in Heather's shawl, which is actually in the photos in your pattern here, is a colorway called Juniper. So we'll notice in the materials for the shawl that it has some information about the yarn. And one of the things that's most important is that you need a yarn. Did I actually have the sense to grab one? Yes, I did. You need a yarn that's going to have a very distinct section of color in the skein that's different from the rest of the yarn. So this colorway is Land's End, and it's noticeably got a bright yellow section in amongst dark blue. So this is what you need in order to knit this pattern. So if you're not using a kit and you're using yarn from your stash, perfectly acceptable, by the way, you still get to be in the draws for the prizes. This is what you need, and you need that color section to be at least 8 inches long. And the reason for that is that you will have enough of this different color in order to work the second stitch in this shawl. So there's 2 stitches that get assigned to this section of color throughout this shawl. One is basically a reverse stocking stitch, and the other one is something called Seafoam stitch. And if you have 8 inches of your contrast in color within this skein, then you'll be just fine because you'll have enough yarn in order to be able to knit that Seafoam stitch. If it's more than 8 inches, the pattern does tell you how to center that. But I'm just going to open this skein up and just show you what I mean by a section of color. So you can see how this skein was dyed with this section of color in yellow in amongst all the blue. So there's lots and lots of dyers who will do colorways like this, where they will have that one distinct area of color in amongst others. And some of the ones that would be really fun would be ones like a rainbow. And actually we have one of our wonderful local yarn stores who we do wholesale for has commissioned a colorway that would be so cute because it's based off fireworks in the sky, and that color section is a rainbow. So that's London Yarns, and you might want to look for that if you want something really fun or decide you need to knit a second shawl. Anyway, that's what you need for that, is 1 skein minimum like that. The shawl comes in 2 different sizes. So one is a 1 skein shawl and one is a 2 skein shawl. So that's what this small and medium thing is about. The small I consider a small shawl because it is wearable as a shawl, but it's also wearable as a kerchief. The other one, once upon a time, we might have thought of it as large, but nowadays in the world of shawls with Stephen West and Find Your Fate and Andrea Mowry, it's a medium-sized shawl. So it's actually pretty restrained, and it's not going to be like a Find Your Fate where you've got 11-foot long fabric to try and wind about your neck. Really, Lily? Sorry about that, guys. She's stuck in a box, she says. Now she's scratching and making meat noises. Super helpful cat. So next, the pattern talks about, in the notes at the bottom of page 2, this shawl is designed to be worked with assigned pooling. So like I said, you need a colorway that has a distinct section of yarn, and any sort of assigned pooling will take that distinct color and it will have a stitch assigned to it. So in the shawl that we're knitting, I decided to assign 2 stitches to it. So we'll be alternating between those 2 different stitches. You do not have to follow the sequence that I did in terms of the stitches in your shawl. You can mix them up however you want. I am giving you permission to do that now. But it does talk about how you need that, and it does remind you about how long that section should be. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. If you forget what you need in terms of the yarn, it's right there on the bottom of page 2. Now, sometimes we're going to choose a skein of yarn, for example, our dear Lake Louise here that I have a teeny tiny ball of, and there might be more than one section of color in that yarn. So that means you have to decide which section of yarn, which section of color in that yarn skein, rather, you're going to assign your color to. There we go. So now this skein of yarn has light blue, gold, and dark blue. So in this skein of yarn, I know that the gold is actually long enough to use because it measures 8 inches, but so is the light blue. So at this point with a skein of yarn like this, you have to choose which color gets assigned to have stitches. And then you'll use the stitches that are assigned, the assigned pooling stitches, only in that color. So for example, in this skein, what we might do is we might assign to it stitches that will show up in the yellow section of the yarn, and they don't get put into any other section of this colorway. So the dark blue and the light blue are just knit in stocking stitch, and we will assign a different stitch to the gold. So that's what that is talking about at the top of page 3. You can use other skeins of yarn. So if you had a kit for this, you really enjoy the shawl and you need to do another road trip, You can use yarn from your stash or colorways that you find particularly delicious. And if they have more than 2 colors in the skein, pick a section that's 8 inches long and assign the stitches to that one only. So like I say, in this skein of yarn, you would assign the stitches to only either the light blue or only the yellow. So that's something that's important there too if you have multiple colors. A lot of people will be working this from stash, and I just wanted to make sure that you can use any yarn that you have. We also have had a really juicy sale going on all week long where we are clearing a lot of yarn from dye lot ends and things like that. And so if you bought a bunch of yarn on that and feel you need to make more shawls, this will help you to choose which skein will work best and what to do with it. So the way that the shawl works is that we're going to just cast on Lake Louise. Okay, so I'm just going to pause. There was a question in the chat. You're having trouble figuring it out in terms of pop colors. So I actually have a little tiny shawl that we'll be going through tonight and looking at. And I chose the white because the white is actually the section of color that's different in there. It's soft and it might have some gray over it in spots, but the white has a long enough section in Lake Louise to do your color pops, your assigned pooling. So Lake Louise, go for the white. And I'll put that under the other camera later and you'll be able to see it and get an idea of how it looks. And then I'm going to demonstrate some stitches with it too. So you're going to cast on your 6 stitches and you're going to establish your shawl at first by just working the shaping rows. Once we have gotten past 5 of those repeats of color, so we cast on our shawl, then that is on page 6, the instructions there. And then you're going to work back and forth in stocking stitch. And you definitely want to do what I'm saying on the borders there. And there's some tips I'll go through on those. But you're going to want to get past that yellow section, at least if you're using this colorway, at least 5 times before you start doing the assigned pooling stitches. So the tip of your shawl, if you look at this one, is just going to work with stocking stitch. So there are 5 sections of color here before I begin the assigned pooling stitches. So that's just something I want to draw to your attention because there are a lot of words on the page in here. And how you're going to begin is just begin with stocking stitch until you get more stitches on your needle. So once you get past 5 of those colors, there will be enough stitches on your needle where you can start throwing in some assigned pooling stitches and you won't end up with a lot of like, oh my goodness, I'm overlapping this constantly. So it'll make it easier if you just start off with some stocking stitch. If you're a little worried about it, if you had a really, really long section of color you were assigning stitches to, you can knit further into it before you begin the assigned pooling. There are no rules on this particular shawl. So it's up to you to decide where you want to do this. And as a little aside, if you felt that just 2 assigned pooling stitches were boring, you could actually use stocking stitch periodically for the color as well. Once you have gotten past that 5th time that you've come across the color that you are assigning a stitch to, that's where you're going to start doing your assigned pooling stitches. Now, all of this assigned pooling and all of this stuff can get kind of verbose. And it was actually quite interesting behind the scenes while we were trying to decide what terminology to put into the pattern that wouldn't make the pattern another 10 pages long. So we're just going to call it our assigned pooling color. So in the case of this skein, our assigned pooling color is the yellow. And we have a sample of that here on my needle still. So our assigned pooling color in this one is yellow. In this particular shawl, our assigned pooling color is blue. And in the one that you saw briefly with Heather, the assigned pooling color there is green. So it's just the color that you chose that you're going to give a stitch. The first stitch that we're going to use is basically a reverse stocking stitch. So now I'm going to switch cameras and spotlight this one because this is going to give you a really good view of what this looks like. So here is our shawl and our tip of our shawl. And this is where we have started to assign a stitch to our contrasting color, our assigned pooling color. So what happens in the first one is that you're just going to knit the reverse of the stitch that you're doing. So if you're on the right side of the knitting, you will be knitting with a knit stitch. You'll be working a knit stitch. So when you get to this color, you would start purling. And you would purl until you reach the end of your contrasting assigned pooling color. See what I mean about the terminology? You just want to add more words to it every time you say it. And then you go back to the regular stitch that you would knit on that side. If you come to that color section on the wrong side of the work, you would do exactly the same thing. There you would be purling across because you're working a stocking stitch shawl. So you would switch to knit stitches in your assigned pooling color. That's all there is to that one. Super simple. And what happens is that when you come back and you work the next row over top of it, you get this look like there's a string of pearls, which is really quite fun. Let me bring that up so you can see that really close. And it's raised above the surface of the fabric. So that's a nice, fun little one that you can throw into shawls, but you could also put that into a sock. And in fact, a friend of mine has designed a sock called Ribbed for Her Pleasure that is a toe-up sock that uses this particular principle, and it is assigned pooling, except she published the sock before this particular term became popular. So I thought that was quite cool. So great minds think alike on the assigned pooling. The second stitch that we're doing is called a seafoam stitch, but you'll find this in stitch dictionaries under all sorts of other different names. The reason why I've decided to go with the name of seafoam is because it looks like the foam on the edge of a wave as it curls over. So this one is just done with some yarn overs that get dropped on the next row, and it creates this zigzag effect. It's kind of fun, doesn't distort your fabric too much, but just gives you a really interesting look in your shawl. It's very simple to work, and I'm going to show you an example of how to do it, but those are the only two things that are different in terms of the entire body of the shawl. You'll work both rows 1 and 2 through the entire body of the shawl, and when you reach your assigned pooling color, you will give it one of these 2 stitches. The shawl usually, that's a good way of putting it. The shawl usually does 1, 2, 3 of the reverse stocking stitch, 1 seafoam, and then 1, 2, 3 seafoam stitch throughout most of the shawl, but you don't have to stick to that. If you decide that you want more seafoam stitches, you can do that. It's not going to harm the shawl in any way. If you decide that you want fewer of them, you can do that as well. So it's up to you. You have control over your wheels and which direction you turn them in, and I am now giving you permission to mix this up. There are times too that we'll want to mix this up a little bit just because of what happens as you're knitting back and forth on the shawl. So let's see if there's anything else I want to tell you about page 3. On the seafoam stitch, I've told you how to work it if you have encountered it on a right side row, and I've also told you how to work it if you encounter it on a wrong side row. Basically, you're going to just work the stitch using whatever you would be doing on that side of the work. So if you encounter a seafoam stitch on the right side of the work, just knit the stitches. If you encounter a seafoam stitch on the wrong side of the work, you can purl the stitches. However, if you would like to create a raised edge along the seafoam stitch, reverse it. So this is where you get really funky and you start designing your own little version of the stitch. So if you were on the right side, you would do the wrong side instructions and vice versa. Hopefully I'm not confusing you, but I am trying to give you lots of permission to play with these stitches because it's a simple shawl. You won't need the instructions once you have got started on it. And there's no reason you can't play throughout the course of the shawl. So I will tell you right now that I have done that in places on this particular shawl. And let's see if I can find one where I did that. I'm pretty sure I'll find it in the big blue blob. Oh, here's one. Okay, so when we look here, let's let the camera focus. Come on, camera, you can do it. If you see here, this ridge here that's raised, that's because I did the reverse when I knit my seafoam stitch. So it gives it a little bit of an interesting texture on the top. And I did it again on here because I was just having fun with it. So you can either do it exactly as written, or you can flip it around and do the purl stitches on the right side and the knit stitches on the wrong side, or you can do a mix of them. Like I say, you can have fun with it. If you got mixed up and did it the other way, it would also not harm it in any way, shape, or form. It actually looks really cool, so don't worry about that kind of thing. Because every once in a while, you might be going along and something really exciting happens on the TV, and suddenly you realize that you were doing it as if it was the reverse stocking stitch. So don't worry about it if you do that, because definitely 1 or 2 of those happened on me. I was watching, what was I watching? Doesn't really matter, but it was very exciting. Some sort of murder mystery show, Scandinavian noir, and there was like the bad guy and all the things were happening, and yeah. Okay, now this is something that I put in the instructions because on occasion I have said the seafoam stitch needs 16 stitches and you will work it in the way that I have described. But what if you pick up a piece of yarn or a skein of yarn, not a piece of yarn, and the repeat of the color that you're assigning pooling to is more than 8 inches long? There are instructions in the pattern to tell you how to distribute the extra stitches on each side. So this shawl is a good example where, let's get one where there's nothing around it. There are extra stitches on each side of the actual seafoam stitch itself. So the seafoam stitch itself has 7 yarn overs. And because there was extra yarn, that yarn is distributed on each side of the seafoam stitch itself. And the way that you do that is really simple. To figure it out, just go back to one of your stocking stitch sections at the beginning, or you could pick one of your reverse stocking stitch sections and count the number of stitches. So in the case of this particular shawl, my number of stitches that are used when I knit the gold section are 20. The one that was done on the original shawl with the gentian colorway has a length of yarn that requires 16 stitches. So you're going to take the 16 and subtract it from the 20 of the color that you're using. That gives you 4. And then you're going to divide that into 2 and just put 2 stitches on each end of the seafoam stitch. So what that means is that when I knit my seafoam stitch, I knit 2 stitches in the yellow, then I work the seafoam stitch, and then I knit the other 2 stitches at the end, which gives me a nice symmetrical spacing in the seafoam in the assigned pooling color. Another way of doing this, which is actually quite pretty and makes it sort of look like a bit of a shooting star, is don't worry about all that math stuff and just knit the seafoam stitch and knit the rest of the stitches in that assigned pooling color in stocking stitch. And then you get a nice tail on one end. So it kind of looks like a comet shooting along. So if you don't want to do the math and if you don't want to divide the stitches up, don't worry about it. Just throw the extra color on one end of the seafoam stitch and think, ooh, isn't that pretty? And because you'll be working them on the right side and the wrong side, what will happen is that the tails will go in various different directions. So it'll swoop across your shawl, which is a lot of fun. By the way, I've spotted one here where I did that thing with the reverse stocking stitch on this one as well when I worked this seafoam stitch. So you see how all the yellow stitches, hopefully the camera is showing it. Let's hold still and see if it gets it. They're all done in reverse stocking stitch just for fun. This one also had a long tail and I played with doing the reverse stocking stitch on the extra stitches too. Something that you should also know is that hand-dyed yarns will sometimes have some variation in them. And that means that sometimes you might not have enough of your color for your seafoam stitch. Don't worry about it. Just keep on knitting it. Work it as it's written. It's not going to be a problem. You'll never notice it in the finished shawl. And sometimes you might have a little bit more of the color than you expected. And again, just knit the rest of the stitches as normal in stocking stitch. This is because when you dye yarn, yarn likes to wiggle around. And I always like to think of it as it comes from a living creature. So there's wool in this yarn and sheep like to bounce around the meadows. And some of them, they like to jump fences. So that's what's happening when you're dyeing your yarn is it kind of hops around a little bit. So no matter how careful you are to be precise, every once in a while, you'll have a little bit of variation in that. So I'm just warning you ahead of time, not to worry about it. Consider it a feature of your shawl, and it gives you some really nice random variation. Now let's talk edges. This particular pattern has you slipping the first edge stitch, and that gives you a nice, smooth, pretty edge on your knitting, and it's done on both sides. You could decide to drop that and knit it if you want, but I suggest that you leave it there because it does give you a little bit of a firmer edge, which gives the shawl a little bit more structure and makes it easier to block. It means it won't go all saggy because if you're using a superwash yarn, you need to give it a little bit of structure so it holds its shape for years to come. This sample here was actually blocked months ago, and that nice little bit of firmness that the edge gives it means that it isn't losing its shape. It's not falling apart, not sagging. So leave that slip stitch there if you can bring yourself to do it. And then the next thing is that as you knit a right side row, you're doing a yarn over 2 stitches in. That's increasing 1 stitch every 2 rows. So you need to do that increase in some way, shape, or form. And I know that sometimes shawls will do increases that are different on the edge. So for example, a knit front and back or a make one of various different sorts. The yarn over here is actually pretty important because it gives you a little bit of ease on the edge of the shawl. If you don't have that bit of ease, then it's going to be really tight and really hard to block. So I would suggest staying with a yarn over as your increased method because it gives you that bit of ease along the edge of the shawl. And it also can give you just a little bit of a lacy look along there. So I can hold this open for you and can see that your edge is just floating slightly away from the body of the shawl. And it's just a kind of pretty look to it. You see there. Now, when you go back on the reverse side, what happens is that you're going to do a knit two together on the outside of your shawl, and you're going to replace that stitch by doing a yarn over at the end of the row. There are two different ways you can do that yarn over, and it's going to either make it tighter or looser on the inside edge. So let me grab my little sample here and let's do a few things. What was I doing with this little sample? Oh my goodness gracious me. I switched the needles on this one and I realized I put this stitch on backwards. Oh, that's what I did. Put the yarn in between the stitch. Okay, so this particular little miniature shawl that I've started is in Lake Louise, and this is actually a really good example of seeing that yarn over edge there. Let's see if we can get that to show on the camera well. Put it over black. There you go. You see that nice little lacy edge on there? That's what the yarn overs give it. I have come to my assigned pooling color, and the stitch that I am going to be doing next is going to be my reverse stocking stitch. This is the purl side of the work, so I'm just going to knit my stitches until I get to my edge. And that's going to raise them on the other side and give you that fun little bead purl kind of edge here, that look. I suddenly realized I better check to make sure you guys can see the needles. Now, you are going to do a yarn over 2 stitches before the edge, and this is where you have a choice as to how the yarn over is done. You could either bring the yarn just across the needle, or you can wind the yarn in a full loop around. So one is the short way of doing a yarn over, and one is the longer way of doing the yarn over. This will actually change the amount of ease in your shawl. If you tend to be a tight knitter who pulls their stitches really snug at the edge of the shawl, make that yarn over a little bit longer. So the lovely and talented Heather, when she knit her shawl, used the long way because it gave her a little bit more ease on the inside of her shawl and it made it easier to block. So if there wasn't enough ease on this, you would get this, you see the wrinkling that's happening in the fabric right now because it's unblocked, you wouldn't be able to get rid of that. If you're a really loose knitter, so I tend to knit loosely when I'm barreling along with one of these shawls. So I do the shorter yarn over because that just tightens that edge up, just that wee little bit. That means that I get a nice smooth edge on the shawl. So that's something that's really a fairly important factor on the shawl edge, is to leave it as it's written with a yarn over, and then just think about whether or not you want a little bit more slack on that edge of that shawl. And the difference with just that different yarn over on the one side, the wrong side, is going to make a huge difference on your shawl. On the inside, on the right side, what I actually did for my yarn over was the full distance yarn over. So somebody's asked if I can demonstrate those again. I will happily do so. I'm actually going to pick this back a little bit too, so you can see what those look like when you're purling.
Can you move your hands closer to underneath the camera?
Yeah, I will as soon as I get to
Okay.
where I'm going to show the stitch itself, because I know it goes all over the place. I really need like X marks the spot on here. Okay, so we've now gotten, let's let the camera catch up. We've gotten to the edge of our shawl where we're going to do our yarn over. This is where I've been purling, pretending that this was the regular body color and that I didn't want to do any assigned pooling to it. And I can either just bring the yarn over the needle to knit my edge stitch like that, or don't you do that, you rascally thing. What I would do is a longer yarn over. So one of them, you just come over the top of the needle, and the other one, you bring the yarn under the needle and bring it over the top. There's a totally different amount of yarn in those. And like I say, you'd be surprised at the difference that makes. Now, if you're confused or wondering what's going on with that, there are actually 2 different types of yarn overs. And in British knitting, they actually specify them by giving them a different name. Unfortunately, here in North America, we've kind of lost the idea of 2 different yarn overs. And so we tend to not really specify which it is, and we use the same symbol and name for something that is actually quite different. So this one, where you're just bringing the yarn over the needle and just going straight into a knit stitch, is shorter by half, and it will give you a tighter edge. The one where we wrap it around twice, so we bring it under the needle and around, that gives us twice the amount of yarn, and it gives us a much bigger loop. Now, let me just knit the next stitch on here. When we go back along here in my sample, I actually did this deliberately so that you could see the difference. And let's put something black under here so it stands out. So you see the one hole here, that's a lot bigger. That's where I've done the yarn over that goes around the needle further. So it gives you more yarn. That's the one that wrapped around the needle that didn't just cross over the top. So it gives me a bigger hole and it gives me more ease in there. So you see the difference in the size of the holes. So that's the difference in how that yarn over will behave. And it's up to you to decide how you want to knit it. If you are a loose knitter, do the shorter one. If you are a tight knitter, do the longer one. If you don't want to worry about it, do whatever you want. It's not going to hurt the shawl. If it ends up that you can't quite block this part smooth, honest to God, you're not really going to notice it when you wear it. So I just wanted to give you that tip on yarn overs and give you that little bit of extra lesson on them, because I know that a lot of people who have decided to do this shawl are less experienced knitters. And I think that's really something interesting to know about it. So now what happens if you, oh, actually, you know what? I'm going to stop. And Heather, why don't we draw for one of our gift certificates? Because I could talk for like the next hour and a half if given the chance.
Okay, can you also just explain which side you should do the long, like if you're a fairly equal on gauge, if you should do the long yarn over on the short side or on the long side while I draw something?
So what you might do is on the right side, do a normal yarn over that wraps all the way around. So we'll come here and I will get this under the camera where people can see it. And then I'll do my normal yarn over that goes all the way around the needle. You see that big hole? That's from the one on the back side. I shouldn't have chosen white for this. Let's stick a finger there. It's on the wrong side of the work is where you're going to make the decision about the length of the yarn over that you're going to use. If anyone is confused about this, do feel free to email us and I can write this out for you in text, because I know that for some of us, it's hard to see on cameras. If we're using a phone, there's this wee little thing. And so I'm more than happy to write that out. It's not in the pattern because we were already at 6 pages of text and I didn't want to inundate you guys with something that was supposed to be easy peasy lemon squeezy. So Heather, are you ready to draw?
Yeah, I have Kate O'Neill as the winner of the $50 gift card.
Congratulations, Kate. So what you're going to do to claim your gift certificate is you're going to need to email us, and you're going to email sales@ancientartsfiber.com, and the lovely and talented Wendy will set up your gift card for you. So Heather, if you can just put that into the chat for Kate, that would be fantastic. All right. More tips and tricks about knitting the shawl. In a perfect world, all of our lovely little assigned pooling sections, the email is sales@ancientartsfiber.com. And Heather will put
just
that
sent it to you in the chat, Kate.
Perfect. Thank you, Heather.
Yeah.
So in a perfect world, our assigned pooling color sections show up in the middle of the shawl and they never interfere with anything, except in reality, what's going to happen is they're going to run into your edges all the time. What do? You want to keep the garter stitch on the 2 edges the same. So there is actually a teeny tiny garter stitch border on the edge. So what happens is when you get to the edge stitches, even if you're working in your assigned pooling color, just do the edge like you normally would. So on the outside edge, you will knit the last 3 stitches. And when you go to the wrong side, you're still knitting those stitches. You're knitting 2 and knitting 2 together. Do that. Don't change what you were doing, because it's going to get really, really crazy if you try to change that. Just leave it as it's written for the main part of the shawl. Don't try and do any assigned pooling stitches on the borders. If you have a section where it's going to wrap around like this, now you get to be creative. You can, once you've finished your little tiny garter stitch border, revert to doing your assigned pooling stitch, or you can just go back to doing stocking stitch, and you can do both. So I have actually done both on this shawl just for fun. So this is a good example where I have just reverted to stocking stitch. Let's see, here is a place where I have actually continued the reverse stocking stitch when it wraps around the edge. So this is in the written instructions. It does talk about this because I know all of us are going to be going, oh my God, when we start knitting this shawl and it's 2 in the morning and we can't stop and we're addicted and this happens for the first time. Ask me how I know this with various different shawls. Here's another example of one where I did the reverse stocking stitch on the right side, and then when I came back on the wrong side as well. So it looks a little different. So you can do either, like this one. I really got fancy on this one. I was working on the right side, got to the end of the row, so I was doing my reverse stocking stitch, turned my work. Where I had done the reverse stocking stitch on the right side, I did normal stocking stitch on the back side, and then as soon as I got past that, I went back to reverse stocking stitch. So do you see how that looks there? So you can be as creative or as boring with this as you want. Now, it's not boring. It's actually just cruising down the highway in my way of thinking. You can also, if you're worried about these, just knit them a stocking stitch. They'll all blend into the shawl, and it's a lot of fun to just mix it up and play with it a little bit. So when it wraps around the edges, don't worry about it. You can play with it, or you can just leave it as plain stocking stitch. One place that may possibly give you fits is if one of your lovely seafoam stitches runs into the edge of the shawl. If you have enough stitches to be able to work it and still do your border as normal, leaving your 3 border stitches in garter stitch, go for it. And in this tiny sample, that actually happened with my first seafoam stitch. So my first seafoam stitch, I had exactly the right number of stitches to be able to put it up against my garter stitch border. So I went ahead and did it. If I was short stitches, I would have just put in a reverse stocking stitch assigned pooling section. So if your seafoam stitch is going to run into the border and you don't have enough stitches to finish it, then what you can do is just, instead of doing the seafoam, do another repeat of your reverse stocking stitch. And then on the next section of the color, the assigned pooling color, you can throw your seafoam stitch in. No one will ever know. In fact, you won't know. And I will also guarantee you this, that when the murderer is revealed and it's deeply exciting, or there's a moose by the side of the road, that you will forget how many of these that you have done and no one will ever know. Throw a seafoam stitch in when you next think to do it, and then start counting to 3 again on the reverse stocking stitch. Honestly, it won't matter. That actually is something that you can do that will be really useful, because based on stitch counts, and it will be different for each skein, every once in a while, what's going to happen is that these are going to start stacking. And this is a factor of the number of stitches in the shawl at this point and the length of your assigned pooling color section. And it's super mathematical. And all you need to know is that if it starts doing this and you don't like the look, you can cause this to stop. And what you're going to do to stop it is do a couple of seafoam stitches in a row, instead of spacing them with the assigned pooling stitch number 1, which would be your reverse stocking stitch. Do 2 of them in a row. And here's the perfect example where you see 2 of them done right after the other. And this was to break this pooling section up, because it was starting to stack here, and it probably would have made something about this wide before it finally moved on, thanks to stitch count changing in the shawl. So if you start to get blotches of color forming like this and you don't like them, then you can move the color by putting 2 seafoam stitches one after another. If that doesn't do it, put another 2 in the next couple of rows, and that will for sure break that pooling up. So there's a couple of times on this particular shawl here where this happened. So you see how it started stacking on this edge. So what I did was I threw a seafoam stitch in one after another elsewhere on the row. So there's one, and actually there's the other in that row. So that just broke that little pool up there, because I decided I didn't want it. If you like getting a great big chunk of color, let it do it. There's no harm in that. This one actually has that, and it happened twice in here. So you see how on this particular border, I got a big chunk of color here. So again, I did my seafoam stitch, 2 of them in a row, and that broke that up. And then it started happening here, where we see this section of yellow here, it was pooling. So again, 2 seafoam stitches just got rid of that. So that's just something to know, that you can change the way the color is behaving in your shawl just by using a different combination of the stitches. So you can really play around with those. All right, let me have a quick look at things here. Now, when you get to the end of your shawl, on the big one where you're using 2 skeins of yarn, I've given you an actual stitch count to tell you where to start doing your border. And it's a moss stitch border. It's super simple, and there is no assigned pooling anymore in the moss stitch border. Just let the color follow the moss stitch pattern, You're not going to put seafoam in there. You're not going to try and do any reverse stocking stitch. Just let it be as it will in the moss stitch. It still looks very pretty, as you can see in this border. But when you get there on the big one, it'll be 192 stitches. And that's where you switch to your border, because you will have enough yarn to do your border and your cast off with a little bit of extra built in there. If you are using a mini skein, you would just knit another few rows. I've listed in the pattern how many more to do, and then you can put your contrasting mini as your border on your shawl. If you're doing the one skein version, there are instructions on how long to go on there as well, and you'll find those on page 6. And it talks about what to do if you're not using a contrasting mini skein, and it talks about what to do if you are. So if you're using a mini skein for your border, you just knit till you run out of yarn. And then you switch to your mini skein and you can do your border. If you are going to work this shawl and you're not using a contrast color, then you need to stop before you run out of yarn. And it gives you the amount of yarn, either in the approximate number of rows worth of yarn that you need, and thinking about that you need 3 times the length of a row to knit it in terms of your yarn. So you're going to want to measure out the amount of yarn that you need for a row, times it by 3, times it by the amount that you need for the shawl. Or if you have access to a scale, then just use a scale and weigh it. I strongly suggest for the small shawl that if you don't want to have to think in any way, shape, or form, knit till you run out of yarn and put a contrast border on it. It's super cute. And it just means that, you know, this is your true vacation experience where there is no thinking. So I am sorry to you medium shawl makers that I'm going to make you count, but it is important on that one, because I didn't want to make you try and map out how much yarn you would need once your rows are so long that you'd have to have a super long needle in order to figure this out. So it's a little bit different in terms of the two, but I really love the idea of just throwing your contrasting color on there. And you can absolutely just use leftover yarn from another project. You don't have to buy a specific mini skein. You can also mix yarn bases for this too, for your border. It's not going to hurt it. So for example, one of the shawls that I have, because apparently I'm addicted to knitting these now, I'm going to use, actually, the body is in little nettle sock, and I'm going to use a socknado leftover from a sock for my border. So that's something that you can do there. Alrighty. Now, I think I've gone through all of the most important points on the pattern, and at this point in time, we have some time remaining in our session. Would anybody like to ask some questions? No? Feel free to unmute and ask at this point if you would.
I just wondered, Caroline, if you have any other sample shawls to show us, or have we seen them all? Like, are there any pinks?
So here's the funny part, is that we knit them in pretty much all of the colors, and then they went home with all the staff knitting them. So I don't have a pink one. The pink is actually really pretty. It would have a very similar background in terms of the speckles are fairly soft, but you will notice some variation in the background color like you do in the juniper and the gentian that you see photographed in the pattern. The pink itself is a really nice hot pink. One of the questions that people will probably wonder is, what kind of color would you pair up if you're putting another color on for the border? And one of the easy ways to do that, to know what'll really work, is just pick up on one of the speckles in the main colorway if you're using one of ours. If you're using a skein of yarn from your stash that might not be from Ancient Arts, the shock, the horror, then again, look at the yarn and pick up on another color that's already in there, and you'll be able to match it up without it clashing. So the hot pink one is a really fiery one. It's really cute. And I'm really sorry that I don't have the samples here. I also realized that I wasn't smart enough to take a photo of the pink one. So I have a photo of Wendy's beautiful purple rock press, and I have Heather's juniper. And oh my God, I just realized I didn't take a photo of Steph's zinnia. The zinnia one is fantastic. It is beautiful and bright and sunny, and it just looks like a bed of marigolds with zinnias mixed in. It's so much fun. It's also an interesting one because the color repeat on that is a little bit longer. And that means that her reverse stocking stitch is more noticeable in her shawl, and her seafoam stitches are longer. So what I'll do is I'll get her to take a photo for us, and we'll post it on social media so you can see it. Same thing when I track down that nice pretty pink one.
Oh, thank you. That would be great. Yeah. I really like the subtle bits of color, speckles, light speckles in the background when I was winding my juniper today.
Yeah, we had a lot of fun designing those colorways, and I've been really pleased with how they've been working out. And I've got to say that I am madly in love with Lake Louise in this shawl as well. I've knit Lake
Yeah.
Louise, a couple of other shawls in my time, and I was like, it's pretty, yeah, good enough, whatever. But this video camera does not do it justice in this particular shawl. So I was like, oh, darn, because I was doing a sample for this particular Zoom and I used a mini skein that I had kicking around. Well, now I'm going to have to steal another full skein and make a small shawl out of just this because I'm really happy.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm doing it with Lake Louise, and I would like to get a mini skein. What would you advise as far as a mini skein that would go well with the Lake Louise?
Oh my goodness, there are so many different options there. What is your favorite color?
Basically teal or aqua.
Okay, perfect. So you could put Island Breeze with this for a light one, or what is that one that was in that shawl, Heather? The kits. Tropical Getaway.
Yeah.
Tropical Getaway is a really nice teal.
Do we
You
still have
go-
Mama's Retro?
No, that's not teal. That's sort of that's
Yeah.
green.
Yeah.
The other one that would be really pretty would be blue spruce, Heather's favorite color.
It
So
is
all
a bit
of
of a
those
joke.
do well with Lake Louise, and it would give you that really nice flash of teal there. It just gives you different shades. If you want something kind of minty green like the background color of Lake Louise, then I would go for a colorway called, very originally Minty Mint. So this is actually very similar to the background. Now this is Delicacy, so you don't want that, but we do have it on Socknado. I just don't have it with me. So those would be some good options.
Would you do a gold growth or a
Oh yeah,
yeah.
old growth would be beautiful if you want a nice deep green. There is some chartreuse in there. You could pick up on the chartreuse, and if you want a really bright edge, you could go for either Soda Pop or Uranium 235. You could pick up on those nice rich grays, and you could put like a nice steel, like a Russian silver blue on there. That would be really elegant. And Heather, while we're answering questions, it's time to draw our second gift certificate. Okay. So a good contrast color for zinnia. That is a wonderful question. So again, for zinnia, if you wanted to pick up on the orange in there, you could go for a nice deep one. So you could pick something like Swashbuckle or Delicate Arch, because those are both oranges, but they have more contrast. They're deeper colored. You could pick up on any of the pretty yellows in there. You could do something that would be a little fun, like maybe go Dear Little Buttercup, so pick up on that nice soft background color. You could put something like a green with it. Oranges go really pretty with greens. So you could go anything from dune grass, which is a soft color, all the way down to, again, like an old growth forest. Those would all go very well with zinnia. Pinks would also be super pretty. And you can go for a soft pastel pink like Kitten Nose, or you could go for something with a lot of punch like hibiscus. So you want to announce our second winner, Heather?
Yeah, Lolita is our second winner. I'm going to contact her directly through the chat and
Great. Speaking of chat, I am just going to check and make sure that I haven't missed any other questions. The recording for this is going to be posted on our YouTube channel. So what will happen is that Zoom will do mysterious and arcane things behind the scenes, and then they will send us the video, and then we will post it on the YouTube channel so that you can go back and refer to it. Remember too, all of you can just email us directly if you have questions about this, and I will be more than happy to answer them. One of the things that's always fun as a designer is to chat with people about the design. And in this one, I've given you a lot of options for kind of tweaking it. And if you want to consult about those possible options there, then you could certainly give us an email and I'd be more than happy to chat about it. Yes, thank you for putting in the link for London Yarns. So they got some kits for it, but they're going to be getting more of their special limited edition color. And you know what? I can share that for you because it's just so cute. I just realized I have a photo of it. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to give you a crass commercial plug for London Yarns Custom Celebration Color. Look at that. Wouldn't that be fun for this shawl? And the color color section that's a rainbow there, that's taken from the fireworks. They gave us a really cute inspiration, which was a deep blue sky. And then there were all sorts of different fireworks going off in there. And there were turquoise and pink and yellow. And so it's a little bit of a rainbow look there. And that would be super cute in a shawl like this, because you get that rainbow in that seafoam. I think it'd be very pretty. So anyway, it's a limited edition. It's only for them. And you can certainly order it through them, because they will have that for more than just the kits.
I was really sad when we had to send that one out.
Oh, and what's really sad is I can't even have any of it. And I'm like, darn these exclusive colors that I can't have any. And, oh, fantastic. So there's a comment about remix worsted. It made a lovely cat, very well loved by the child who chose it, and it's wearing very well. I'm thinking that's probably revival worsted, but I'm really glad to hear that. That makes me very happy. Now, something that I didn't mention that one of the questions in the chat makes me think that I really should mention, which is that when you're knitting your shawl, it is going to look like a horrible, scrubby, wee little thing with weird little bulges for the seafoam stitch. And you're going to think, man, that's ugly. And you're going to be really dismayed, and you're going to get to about this far in the shawl. And do you notice something about this one? This particular one is not actually finished. So I've knit this shawl multiple times, but at this point in time, it was killing me to see the seafoam stitches. So I blocked them. And when you block the shawl, all of a sudden, in all its glory, they all stand out and it lies nice and flat and doesn't look like a weird, nasty little bubble. So persevere, courage and fortitude. Those stitches will come into their full glory when you block the shawl. So are there any other questions? You can see they stand out real nice on this one, so you don't have to worry about that. I just realized there's one thing, if you guys don't mind sticking around a little bit longer, that we should do, and that's I should demonstrate to you how we actually create the seafoam stitch. Would you guys like to see that? Okay.
Yes, please.
Yes.
Now, if you can just entertain for a moment, Heather, I've got to get to my color section so that people will be able to see it. So I'm just going to frantically knit here. Good Lord, Dan, you changed the spot. Okay, well, I guess let's
Now I get to be spotlighted. Woohoo!
Yeah.
So has everyone started a cast on? Oh, I see some people holding them up. Are you guys loving it so far? Oh, look at Dr. Jen's got this dark green thing with dark blue. What color is that? So pretty.
Oh, that's gorgeous.
Yeah.
Fantastic contrast.
Yeah. And how many people are doing a 2 skein?
Yay for 2 skeins.
Yay.
Nice. I generally put together all the packaging, and me and Emma ship them out to everybody, with Vanessa helping us out as well. And so I get to see all the little packages go out to you guys, and I see your names. So it's really nice to see all of your lovely faces and get to see your projects as you're working through them. Sometimes I'm tempted to put little notes on your little invoices and get you to send, because we put together these boxes and then we look at them and we're like, oh my goodness, what are they going to make with this box of goodiness? Like it's either colors that we would have never imagined putting together, or the combination just sings, or like on a certain base sometimes. And we see this box of yarn yummy and we're like, oh. So you guys got to remember to send us pictures of your projects or post them on Instagram and tag us with hashtags, because like we love seeing what you guys have made, and we're always curious because we see these great, we can see there's something in the works. And then we also have learned that some of you have very particular taste and you have certain colors that you've like, every once in a while we see, oh, we know where this person, like we just filled a whole bunch of the orders from the sale, and you could definitely see people's palettes and their color preferences. So it's been really fun to see all that get ready to go and be shipped out to you guys.
That's fantastic, Heather.
That's great.
Action too, because that's really fun to hear. Okay, I am set up for my seafoam stitch. I have got to the beginning of my white section, which is the color that I am assigning pooling to, and I am on the wrong side, so I'm going to use purl stitches. So the stitch begins with a purl 1 And then you're going to do a yarn over. Then you're going to purl again. You're going to do another yarn over. You're going to purl a third time. You're going to do a third yarn over. You're going to purl. And at this time, you're going to do a double yarn over. Let's wait for the camera to catch up. And a double yarn over means that you wind the yarn around your needle twice. Again, there's all sorts of different directions that you can go in doing your yarn overs. In this case, if you go like that, so if you go under the needle and around, it's going to make it really awkward in order to do a double yarn over. When I'm purling, I go over the needle and around. Now I'm getting tangled in my yarn. Let's do this again. Over the needle and around, there's one yarn over the needle and around, there's two. Purl a stitch, yarn over, purl a stitch, yarn over, purl a stitch, yarn over, and now we're done the seafoam stitch. Come back here. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my work and then I'm going to knit back. And you see how you've got this tight area on the needle? Come on, camera, you can focus. This is where your yarn overs are. And what we're going to do as we work back along that section is we're just going to drop our yarn overs. Now, I want you to pay a little bit of attention as you come up to your seafoam stitch because it's really easy to accidentally drop the knit stitches instead. But if you pull a little bit on here, you can tell what's a yarn over versus what is not. So I come to the first yarn over, I drop it, knit a stitch. I come to the second yarn over, drop it. Third, drop it. Here's my double yarn over, drop that. Don't worry about whether your stitches look a little bit wonky. When you block, it's all going to even out beautifully. Second last yarn over, drop. Last yarn over, drop, and I keep going. And there is the seafoam stitch that I've just created. Again, they look wonky and weird and horrible, and you won't be able to get them to pull nice and even. Don't worry about it because they will, like magic, behave themselves once you block your shawl. So here is our seafoam stitch. Excellent. Glad that all makes sense. Would anybody like me to do that again?
Yes, please.
Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to absolutely positively cheat, and I'm going to do a seafoam stitch at a different point in the yarn just so that we don't have to wait for me to knit and knit and knit because it's hot in here and the yarn is sticking to my hands. Oh, I seem to be going a little faster now. Let's see what we're going to get to. Ooh, we're going to run off the end of the needle if I go to that color. So we're just going to do a seafoam stitch here for fun. So I have knit a stitch, one yarn over, knit the next stitch, yarn over, knit the next stitch, yarn over. And I actually think to myself 1, 2, 3 as I do this, because otherwise you may end up doing a whole bunch more than you really planned on. Double yarn over once you've done 3, knit a stitch, 1 yarn over, knit a stitch, 2 yarn overs, knit a stitch, 3 yarn overs, and the seafoam stitch is now finished. Now we'll get to the end of our row and then we'll come back and we will drop those yarn overs that we just created. And yes, I'm knitting in a weird way. For those who haven't been exposed to my knitting before, this is called flick knitting, and it's sort of a hybrid of throwing and continental. So we're coming up to our seafoam stitch. So we're just going to purl the first stitch as normal. There's the yarn over, we drop it. Purl a stitch, drop the yarn over, purl a stitch, drop the yarn over, purl a stitch. We come to the double yarn over, drop it. Let it fall off whatever side of your work it just wants to go. It will make no difference. Do whatever the yarn tells you. Drop the stitch, or the yarn over rather, drop the yarn over, drop the yarn over. It tends to like to fall to the wrong side of the work, and you'll notice on both of mine it did. And again, they might look a little bit wonky, they might not, but don't worry about that because this is all going to even out later on. You might also be thinking to yourself, why is this seafoam stitch here so much bigger than the seafoam stitch down here? And it's because I changed needle size so that I would have a color of needle that would contrast with the yarn. So if you happen to knit more loosely, your seafoam stitches will have a little bit more drama to them than if you're knitting more tightly. And if you really don't like the look of it on the needle that you've chosen, change the needle. There is absolutely nothing to say which direction on this road you have to go. All you have to do is save enough yarn to put a border on it. And if you run out of yarn and didn't save enough, switch to something like a contrast yarn, a mini skein, something left over from another project, and so on. So are there any questions at this point on these?
Yeah, I've got one. I need you to remind me when the next session is. I think you and
It's
Wendy.
exactly 2 weeks from today. So it's Friday evening, 7 o'clock, and it's the same Zoom meeting and everything. So we'll make sure that we leave that up on our website that day so that you can just go there to the main page to get the link. And we will, of course, send it out in a newsletter again. All right. So
Thank you.
give us one more chance for questions. And if there isn't anything else, what I will do is send you off on your road trip and look forward to hearing how it's going.
Thank you.
You're really welcome. Thank you.
That's
everyone.
awesome.
KAL. I'm really excited to see all the shawls as we go. And it's so much fun to be taking a trip with everybody. Yay!
Yay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a lovely weekend. Thanks for your time.
Enjoy your knitting.
Hopefully.
You too.
Thank you.